Well, this story requires a little background setting, so please bear with me. There are some shocking moments in it which you need to be able to deal with. And I just might point out to you that this story was told to me by one of my great heroes in life, Winston Peter Nelson, our assistant scoutmaster in Troop 321. Winston was the assistant scoutmaster. Vern Spencer was the scoutmaster. Of course, on Sunday, Winston was the Deacon's Quorum advisor, and Vern was his assistant, so they helped each other along, raising generation after generation, over 25 years of young men out of the Brigham City 15th Ward. And I was blessed to be right in the middle of that adventure from the time I moved to Brigham City from Anchorage, Alaska, until I left for Japan. And that's the story of my youth. I'll tell you, it was a great one. But sooner or later, someone would complain about the cooking. Now, that's not hard to believe. Often we were responsible for our own. There were an awful lot of tinfoil dinners roasted over the fire on the Friday night, and on breakfast we made do with what we liked, cereal or occasionally a pot of mush. But then we'd go off on a hike with Winston. Now, Vern didn't hike so much, but while we were gone, it was his wont to go through our packs and gather up all the food that was in there and mix them together into a stew. Now, that's not so bad. You take your Franco-American spaghetti and you mix it with your Denny Morris beef stew, and it still tastes pretty good. But there are dangers. I remember one time when the can of sardines went into the stew along with those little bitty pink and white candy-covered licorice bits. I'll tell you, even Winston had to raise his nose a bit at that, but we went on because, as my dad would say, hunger's good sauce. Now, I've told this story to my camp staff over the years at Lowell, clear back from 1977, our years at that beautiful camp, Treasure Mountain, years at Bartlett, and that summer at Aspen Ridge up Little Bear River Canyon, and not to mention the 6 summers out on Catalina Island and Cherry Valley. And then for the last 20 years at that beautiful Wadman Lodge in the Jed Stringham Memorial Hall, we've had a chance to share this story. First of all, with the camp staff. The first grumble I hear, they get it, because believe me, there's no one more valuable on your camp staff than the cook, and you can't let the cook get his feelings hurt, or then you're in big trouble. But also with the scoutmasters and adult leaders. Every Thursday, all these years, whether it was out on the picnic benches in front of the old Lowell kitchen, or in that great beautiful lodge at Camp Lowell we have today, we'd invite them all in for a scoutmaster lunch. And there they'd sit around the tables and feast on spaghetti and breadsticks and green salad with dressing, heading for their feast on chocolate cake. And as they began to wind down on the chocolate cake, getting ready to enjoy that great treat, I usually interrupt with this story. So hopefully you'll find it useful as you train your friends and family and your boys, and maybe it'll be a memory or two too. So here we go. Moose Pie, Winston Peter Nelson. I can tell by the looks on your faces and some of the grumbling you're doing that you're not all satisfied with the cooking. Well, I better tell you a story. You know, no one's ever satisfied with the food at a Boy Scout camp. No one's ever satisfied with food at camp. That's just the way you are. People complain it's not what you get at home. But there was a lumber camp up in Washington State. There they cut down the big trees. I'm not talking about your little pole forest like we have here in Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. I mean big trees. Trees as big around as these tables are long, standing 200 feet up in the sky. But of all the dangers and effort that goes into cutting those giant trees and hauling them down, the hardest job to keep filled at that camp was the cook. You see, it didn't matter who he got, that poor old foreman, be it the sweetest young thing or the meanest old curmudgeon. Sooner or later, someone would cut off with some description of the food that would hurt their feelings, and they'd be out of there, and he'd be up trying to find himself a new cook. That's a disaster. So finally, on one such occasion, he laid down the law. He said that the next person that complained about the cooking would be the cook and would remain the cook until somebody else complained. Well, you can bet at the very next meal, the biggest, meanest, ugliest in the entire camp cut loose with a string of explicatives that curl your hair. That was it. He was the cook. There was no way he could get out of it. Of course, he thought there was. All he had to do was cook something that people would complain about, and he launched off on that campaign best he could. I'm not going to describe the meals he prepared, not while you're eating. Well, I will give you one. Fried potatoes, fried in axle grease and salted with pea gravel. You know, piece of potato a bit overdone in axle grease looks an awful lot like a piece of pea gravel. But those lumberjacks found that if they chewed soft the first bite or two, they could determine which were the piece of stone and pick them out and leave them in a pile at the side of their plate. Thus it went on for 2 weeks. Our hero just lamenting and figuring and thinking, and slowly but surely a plan began to emerge. He started to think of the greatest meal he'd ever eaten in his entire life, one his granny had made. His granny was the cook of the universe, and she used to make a roast beef with the carrots, onions, and potatoes cooked right down in the drippings, and biscuits, oh my land, biscuits to die for, so light that when she pulled out the pan, she had to put a napkin over the top of them, or those puppies would float right up off the pan. Oh my lands, that was the secret. So he started ordering in the supplies, everything he'd need. And then the day came. Right after breakfast, he ran those lumberjacks out of the mess hall. Not hard to do, considering how the place smelled. And then he set to work. Working all day. It'd take him all day, just like it did Granny, to make this meal. But he started working hard. Lunchtime, some of them were hanging around. The scents were starting to improve a bit, but they couldn't see in and they couldn't get in. So they headed back out into the woods to forage. Rather frightening because the bunnies and berries were about all gone. But that afternoon, when the roast was deep in the oven, getting softer and crumbly, he headed out into the woods behind the cook shack with the coal scuttle and found a big pile of moose droppings. Now, you've all seen a moose dropping, I hope. It looks like a big malt ball, kind of elongated. A deer dropping only 3 times, 4 times the size. He gathered that coal scuttle full and brought it back to where he prepared a pie crust. A beautiful pie crust, the way he'd seen his granny do it, so light and flaky, oh my lands. He put it in the pan, he piled in the moose dung, and then he laid the top over, poked in the holes, and set it in the oven, toasting away. And just as he'd seen Granny do it, for the last 10 minutes before it was done, he pulled it out and smeared the top with condensed milk, and put it back in so it came to a golden sheen. And then right at supper time, he rang the bell, and those starving lumberjacks came piling in there, starving and hungry and ready to go. They ate their way through the roast beef, they ate their way through the potatoes, onions, and carrots. They gobbled up the salad and devoured the biscuits. Well, you can bet the very first one done was the second biggest, meanest, ugliest in the entire camp. He cleaned his plate as he looked around for something else to eat. And there he saw the cook standing up by the sideboard. And next to him, this beautiful pie. Now, this guy was a lumberjack, so he knew how to calculate board feet. And he knew there were not enough slices in that pie for everyone assembled. So, cleaned up plate in hand and fork up as a defensive weapon, he headed for the cook. As the cook saw him coming, his face lit up like the rising moon. And as he got there, he shoveled out a full quarter piece of that pie onto that guy's plate. defensive mode again, watching his brother, and he didn't want anyone snitching. He headed back to his seat and sat down. Took off the full front end with his fork and shoved it in his mouth. Moose shit pie! But good!